I am a board member for Impulse Group DC, which is an entertainment-based advocacy group for gay men, and also a social worker and own a social venture that works with racial justice and emotional intelligence. So thanks, thanks again, Courtney, for having me here. I look forward to the dialogue. And Jen, over to you.
Hi, everybody, I'm Jen Abbondanza. I'm not in the habit of sharing my pronouns, so I'm not going to, just in an effort to be authentic. I'll also take the opportunity to plug that it's amazing to make sure that everybody has the option to share pronouns, and it's also important to realize that it's still sensitive and a potentially outing situation. So it's great to, so we never want to force anybody to share their pronouns. That PSA aside, I'm dialing in from New York. I work on the diversity, equity, and inclusion team at NBCUniversal. Let's see, what else about me? I live here in New York with my wife and our 2 elementary school children. And I thought I'd share a fun fact about me because I was reminiscing about my time at Anderson. So unsolicited fun fact, while I was there, I learned how to surf. I surfed a lot. And I'm proud to be responsible for the first ever surf and ski day that we launched while I was there.
I think I saw that fun fact about you somewhere online, Jen. So thank you for resurfacing that. And yes, thank you all for the introduction. So I know each of you mentioned like a little bit about yourself. So I'd love to, as the first question, to dive a little bit more into your personal identities. And so I think around that question, one of the ways that the LGBTQ plus community has talked about identity more frequently over time is kind of referring to our identities as being fluid, whether that's with regard to your sexuality, your gender, or how you even just identified publicly over time. So what does that mean to you, having a fluid identity, and how do you resonate with that? And Jen, I'll have you start it off if you're okay with that.
Sure. I think I joked with the group when we got to know each other last week that I feel too old to be fluid and too overly influenced by society and biases to rethink where I've fallen out. But I will answer this through kind of the eyes of my daughter, which I think is relevant, which is what brings this up for me when I think about fluidity. She is 6 and for most of her life has revolted against gender stereotypes and the expectations that she thinks this girl molds. She cut her hair by herself when she was 3. She prefers wearing soccer jerseys and shorts and playing on the playground with the boys. And that's not a stereotype. It's actually just her experience. The girls don't play the games that she plays in. So we've supported her through this journey, and I feel like it's been a fluid, and it will continue to be fluid for her as she figures out where she is. I'm using her girl pronouns because we checked in with her. She still uses girl pronouns. We've let her know that she can be anything that she wants to be. Her cousin introduced the term non-binary to her, and she immediately resonated, related to that. And, we just are trying to support her as much as we can through this journey. And it'll be interesting to see where she falls out. I can say that one issue, that I think we're all faced with is that these binary gender stereotypes are woefully inadequate. And they don't give children and adults alike enough options to fully express themselves. And I think that may be one of the things that is spurring this fluidity movement. So I'm excited to see where it all takes us.
And Raudy, what about for you? How does the fluid identity resonate with you?
So having been around longer, I think, than all of you, I think it's safe to say, maybe Jen has me beat, maybe, making an assumption there. Nonetheless, when Courtney asked the question as we were preparing, and I heard the word fluidity, I immediately thought about sexuality. And so I'll respond from the perspective of being a gay man. That being said, when she used the word, I also realized that we're using new and different, I'd say maybe modern isn't the right way to describe it, but that's the word that's coming to mind. The word queer is being used in a completely different way today. than it was when I was growing up. It had a very much a derogatory connotation growing up. And when people assumed me to be gay as I wasn't out, they would pick on me and they'd bully me and they'd call me a queer. And so today, to say that I'm queer and that I'm gay is more empowering than what it was growing up. And it took some time to get there. And so my perspective is that of my fluidity has come over time in moving around, being exposed to different cultures, different people, different cities, to become more comfortable with being an out gay man in the world and in the workplace. And the idea of what being gay means, it continues to change. And being part of the LGBTQ plus community, that perspective has continued to be evolved. And having conversations with Jen just now and hearing about how younger generations are thinking about identity.
Thank you, Raudy. And Justin, wrapping it up with you.
Yeah, so when you presented the question in the term fluid, it definitely kind of took me immediately to gender. I know, at least, based on what I've been exposed to, younger people are definitely kind of thinking about gender far more nuanced than, when I was growing up. And so, I'm not somebody who would identifies gender fluid or really think of my identities as fluid, but I definitely think the languages and the terms that I use to describe myself have definitely evolved over time. And hopefully as language becomes more inclusive and there's more space for people to kind of find the terms and identities that reflect their lived experience, that may shift for myself. So I'm interested to see how that kind of continues to evolve.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I guess to go back, since we are in a business school setting, now go into kind of the professional lens and how your personal identity shapes that. And I guess I'll just go back around in the circle. So Justin, you recently graduated from Ross and you're currently working at Microsoft. So for you kind of being in now kind of the newer stages of your career again, like post MBA, how have you approached being out, whether it was on your MBA application, future job applications, or even in the context of your workplace right now?
Yeah. So to give context, coming out of undergrad, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Rwanda, where I extended my service working a little bit with the LGBT community there. And then I also, before going to grad school, worked in addressing the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And so again, I'm used to being in a lot of spaces that are very queer, oftentimes, a large majority of people of color. And so coming to business school, I was like, I don't really know if I can kind of continue to be my authentic self and really kind of show up as queer as I had before. And so I think I was very intentional in trying to, push those boundaries. One little thing was even just my ears are pierced, my nose is pierced. I got all my piercings before business school because I wanted to be very intentional. At least based on my perception, business school is very, binary and very traditional, professional, and that was not me. I mean, I'm also, someone who likes to push, the boundaries. And so I was like, I want to show up authentically. I want to people to ask questions, to really kind of, disrupt some of those binaries and whatnot. Another thing, in business school, I always was very intentional in, and this is, kind of back to the conversation around pronouns. Having worked in, the queer space with, a lot of trans colleagues and whatnot, I would always introduce myself with my pronouns there. And I got to business school and I was kind of noticed myself initially, like I kind of stopped because it wasn't the culture. And I was like, oh, well, now I was just a performative ally. So I was like, let me be more intentional about always making sure I use my pronouns in business school. I also, both in business school and now at my job at Microsoft, will use he or they pronouns just to try and further disrupt kind of that binary. And I've been really, encouraged to see how intentional my current manager is about using they pronouns, just as an opportunity for him to kind of practice and get outside of that gender binary. And so, my application and showing up at my internship last summer and then kind of fully transitioning into my full-time role, I'm pretty outspoken and I try to be very overtly queer because I don't want anyone to ever wonder or question. I want you to know I'm here, I'm queer, and y'all are gonna have to get used to it.
I love that. And I definitely saw that even in our brief interactions online, Justin, in our internship. And then Raudy, you mentioned that for you, your relationship with kind of even identifying as a queer man is something that you had to adjust to because it was used as a derogative when you were younger. So for you, how have you approached being openly gay in terms of maybe not necessarily in your MBA program, but in terms of being out in the workplace, and how have you navigated that?
Yeah, so I'll share more of a personal story. In moving from secondary education, I used to be a high school math teacher and a volleyball coach. And then I decided I can't do this anymore for several reasons. I loved what I did, but it wasn't going to provide the economic opportunity that I needed for myself, a potential family, if not aging parents back at home in South Texas, and nieces and nephews. In making the transition to a corporate setting, there were a ton of challenges. One of those challenges was being comfortable, being all of me every day at work. And I had no idea what that looked like. I didn't know what it sounded like. It was completely unfamiliar territory. One, because I'd never been in HR before. And secondly, I never worked at an investment management firm, much less be part of corporate America, outside of a stint as part of my summer internship. And I can't quite remember when it happened, but early on in my career at a firm here in Los Angeles, I sat down with my leader's leader. His name is Bob. He's still there. And we were having a conversation, and somehow I implied to him that I was having trouble finding my voice and being who I knew myself to be. Being brown, being gay, being from rural South Texas, now in a high-rise in downtown LA, doing everything I didn't know to do. And I didn't know Bob was gay. I thought he might be gay, but he wasn't out at work. And so I was taking those signals, and maybe you shouldn't be out at work because Bob isn't out at work. And in short, Bob looked me in the eyes and he said, "Raudy, we hired you for everything that you are. We hired you because you're gay. We hired you because you're brown. We hired you because you're the rural South Texas kid living in the large city of Los Angeles. We hired you because we believe that you have what it takes to be successful here at Capital Group, and you need to be all of yourself every day." And at that point, huge sigh of relief. I'm like, okay, you can be out, you can be gay, you can be brown, you can be whoever it is that you want to be, all within the context of knowing that I was in a professional setting. And from that point on, I am much more comfortable who I am. Similar to Justin, I have no reservation in letting people know that if I was in a relationship, it would be with a man and he'd be my husband or potential husband, just so that there's no air of, who are you? Why don't you have a family? Where's your wife? I just rid any of that ambiguity from the very start, but it's taken some time to get there.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Raudy. And Jen, I will turn the same question back to you. I know you shared a little bit differently because you're talking about your daughter's experience, but for you personally, how have you navigated being out in your professional career?
Yeah, I came out in my 20s when I was living in New York City and working in finance. And I didn't come out at work. I wasn't comfortable coming out at work. And then I went to business school and drew a line in the sand. And I stepped into my out and authentic life in every aspect of my life from then on forward. So I intentionally try to out myself when I see an opportunity, especially in interviews or any relevant setting, because I don't choose to be around, I don't want to put myself into various situations or job roles where I may not be welcome. That is, I'm bringing it to the table in every aspect. And then I have the luxury of working in diversity where, we feel strongly that it is that bringing every aspect of yourself to your job and being your authentic self is important. We'll bring the best work. And we also recognize that there's still a ton of work to do in this space. And it doesn't always go as smoothly as we design or like it to be. So we're learning, right? And evolving. But yeah, I think that's it. For me, Anderson was a nice landing, soft landing for me to just close the door on being in the closet and never look back.
I'm so glad that Anderson was able to provide that for you. And I know for you, especially, like, you were one of the former presidents of Out at Anderson before it was called Out at Anderson. So I'm very glad that you were really fully able to embrace that part of your identity while you were here. So to move forward from that, so Raudy and Jen, you both mentioned how in your professional careers there was a period of transition where you had to like practice like coming out more publicly and like presenting that part of your identity. And Justin, I know for both of us, given that, you know, we're just coming out of our MBA program, we're in a little bit of a different space. We're kind of expecting companies to have, you know, to be able to provide us with different opportunities and different rights being publicly out. So I'm kind of curious. I want to pose this question to you first of like where would you like companies to continue pushing forward in terms of like providing LGBTQ plus employees like that sort of support or that sort of network that they need to really thrive in a professional setting?
Yeah, so I think companies have a responsibility kind of within their four walls, which I guess is maybe an outdated term now that the world is far more hybrid and virtual, to make sure that's a safe, inclusive, and equitable space. So, you know, everything from culture to benefits, that you're really creating an opportunity for, you know, LGBTQ plus employees to come up and be their most authentic selves. And I think with that, there is a responsibility that, you know, you're holding leadership and management accountable to doing that. And I think that you're hopefully engaging your clients to try and kind of push them forward as well. I think outside of, you know, kind of the campus or, you know, your virtual world, I don't know what I believe is the responsibility kind of a business and the larger society. I think, you know, a lot of people, I think I've definitely been excited. Obviously, I've been a beneficiary of businesses speaking out around, you know, LGBTQ plus rights. But I think we've also kind of seen this happening at a time where, you know, government and elected representation maybe hasn't been as effective or been on the forefront on those issues. And so, you know, are they kind of replacing, you know, the role of kind of maybe government in this area? I think that's actually something that we heard last summer in our internship that kind of made me think about that. And so I think, yeah, there's definitely that responsibility kind of within a business to really create an accepting, inclusive, and equitable space. Outside, to be determined for me. I'm definitely curious to hear other people's opinions on it, though.
And for Raudy and Jen, both of you work in kind of your respective companies' diversity and inclusion spaces. So where do you two see your respective companies like pushing forward specifically with regard to like your LGBTQ plus employees and the rights that they have? I don't know if Jen or Raudy, you want to start? Okay, Jen, go for it.
Sure. I have a lot to say in this space, and Courtney, I might be grabbing some topics that you were going to explore elsewhere, but it's all really relative, right? This is not a linear question. First of all, we're all in a whole new world and territory in terms of companies being called to action to speak about things that are happening outside of their walls, be it physical or virtual. Justin, it's not defined yet, and I think companies are trying to work through it. And you have to do it in a way that's authentic, and it's most comfortable to do it when you already have a body of work to speak to, right? When you've already laid the groundwork and started the process of supporting all underrepresented communities. And so for us at NBCUniversal, we launched our Out ERG almost 30 years ago. You know, we've been active in the diversity space for 2 decades or more now. We started signing on to public statements by companies back in 2015 when there was the first amicus brief about same-sex marriage. There was another in 2019 that we signed on to about equal protection for the LGBTQ community. HRC does great work here in bringing companies to support statements, and we're on 2 of their list, the most recent being the business statement against anti-LGBTQ state legislation that NBCUniversal signed on to last month. And the other element is that you need to make sure that your employees are feeling heard. And that is listening to them. And also, you know, we get all types of employee comments on any matter, right? You're always going to get the full range. It's important for them to feel heard. And that's not always combined with a yes, right? Sometimes we're making tough decisions and in delivering tough messages, it's easier to deliver that when we can speak to the rest of the body of work that we're committed to and the donations that we've been giving over time. And that's a whole nother hot button issue, right? But it's a big onion. There's a lot of layers to it. So, but I think you have to be doing it authentically in a way that isn't just a communications plan. And I'll put out Black Lives Matter as an example. When a lot of companies were making the statement in 2020, some of them, it was just a social media campaign and that there was nothing else behind it, right? And we took longer to make our statement because we wanted to follow it up with what are we going to do in the space? And we committed $100 million to fight social justice, and we put a lot of thought into all of that. So I think another beautiful element of all of this is that, we have people here who work in diversity, right? That's another signal that these companies are trying to be leaders and be proactive, not always be caught kind of on the back foot as these topics arise.
So I'll pick up where Jen left off and then trail back to Justin and start from an external perspective and then go into and what I think we can do better in terms of employees at organizations. So from an external perspective, let's be real here. We all know that some organizations are large. There is a ton of hierarchy. There's, for lack of a better word, a lot of red tape to cut through in order to move swiftly and quickly. And couple that with organizations that are public and have shareholders who represent all types and kinds of people with differences of perspective, have to be mindful of that as well. And so knowing that, while I, Raudy, believe that a company should have a stance and should have a voice, I also recognize that A, they may not be able to move swiftly enough to act. And secondly, they may not act at all because of the cons that may come with putting forth such a statement. Some of what we do at Experian, we will put messages out. Some of them will go out to the external community. Some of them will live solely within the employee base, if you will, and come from an employee resource group. And I'll talk about internally what we can do better in just a moment. Other ways, however, and this is some of the work that I do to show our commitment externally without putting forth a statement. And I get that some of you may realize that this is a bit more passive, but we're supporting organizations that can and hold fast to having that stance in the world that we live in today. So for example, Out and Equal, the Human Rights Campaign, Stonewall, we fund them, their efforts, we do work with them so that they can have a louder voice and they can do more of what they set out to do. So I get that that is an experience speaking on behalf of the topic, but we empower others to do so. When we look internally and we think about employee resource groups or business resource groups or employee networks, I think at a minimum, it's important for that network of individuals to be activated and communicated with regard to whatever it is that is affecting the community and the affinity of focus at a minimum. And you can move much more quickly, in my opinion, through that network than maybe all of the organization and then externally. Aside from that, I think it's important that representation matters. And for someone who's at a mid-level leadership role at Experian, it's important for me to see leaders in executive positions out at work to signal to me that there is a place, there is space, and there's something greater, right? As someone who wants to progress in their career, for me at the organization. And I think that in itself kind of puts action behind the words and of the commitment to show their people and external folks looking in that there is commitment to the growth and to the community overall.
I find it really interesting. So Raudy and Jen, like you both kind of took this stance of maybe maybe businesses like are not so explicit about making some of these statements. Like there are different ways to show their action, and you kind of call it like a passive way of showing action. And I know on our call previously to get together, Justin, you kind of brought up this sense of I think our generation in business school right now, there's definitely a community of people who are increasingly, I think it's safe to say, anti-capitalist. We want companies to take a greater stance politically in terms of like social justice issues. So I'm curious, I kind of want to ask you, Justin, a little bit more about this. Can you dive a little bit more into what your thoughts on like how large of a role you think businesses should be taking in these sort of like social justice issues, specifically with regard to like queer rights?
Yeah. So I think, there's the kind of the political framing where I think, people, like, broad generalizations here, on the left, tend to be very progressive around social policy and social values. Oftentimes are holding, many of their favorite brands accountable for pushing forth publicly, vocally, consistently that same agenda, those same policies. And I definitely share the policies and share those political policy goals and share those progressive values. But I think kind of just in looking at classes, some of the classes I took, in my MBA program, is and just thinking at the end of the day. And this is, again, somebody who, has a dual degree in social work, comes from, the nonprofit advocacy background. I would love for companies to really, truly hold those values and that really be what drives their decisions. But I've also to come and accept that companies, I think, regardless of what they say publicly, the statements they put out, who they donate to, they're there to sustain. And that's going to mean, generating revenue, making money, making a profit, pleasing those shareholders. And so sometimes, it's great. They're going to come out and say things that I support and stand for. But I think other times they're always going to do what they're built to do, what they're created to do. And that's not always going to be consistent with kind of my values. And so I think, if we want to continue, I think, when we expect companies to always kind of speak out and always kind of, push a little bit on not necessarily the scales of justice, but, they have weight, they have clout, they have direct, I was kind of thinking about Florida and Disney here. They're talking about how Florida or Disney has like a special kind of zone where they kind of have a little bit more power, than local government, things like that. So like these corporations are powerful and they can exert their will. And if I know at the end of the day, they're here to, to not necessarily, make all of the money, but they're there to make money. They're there to sell a product or a service. They may not always use that power in the way that I'm going to want them to. And so it makes me a little hesitant to think about how much do we want to prop up corporations? How much power would we want to give them in terms of driving social policy and just kind of, how much social power, social capital they have to influence the world that we live in. So that always gives me a little bit of pause.
And Jen, to kind of tie your answer back to what Justin was saying, I know you mentioned very briefly earlier about some of these bills that came out. So I wanted to return to that. Can you talk a little bit more about for you as in terms of someone working at NBCUniversal, working in D&I, how do you kind of view that sort of fine line that companies have to walk in sort of in the public eye with regard to vocally supporting these bills? And maybe you can also mention a little bit more on how internally companies might be supporting LGBTQ plus employees with certain benefits that they're providing maybe a little more quietly internally.
Yeah. I'll add, just to provide some levity here. I'm a huge consumer advocate. I love jumping on to the bandwagons when we find a corporate bad guy and we want to stand up against them. And I also very quickly recognize, or I'm grateful when that is not a situation that my company is dealing with, and the difficulties that the realities of how companies are trying to navigate and do the right thing, even when doing the right thing is also potentially evolving, or at least we're learning, right? So on the state legislation, I mean, look, this is just we're in such a politically charged world right now. I kind of rattled off some of the things that we've been doing in terms of signing on. I don't think that we feel like we always have to put the spotlight on us, and this might be part of the conservative nature of some companies, or at least my company, where we very rarely sign on to big corporate lists of statements where companies are standing out against something. So we hope that there's power in the few times that we do that. And then we also don't need to recreate the wheel, right? There's a reason why we're partnering with HRC and GLAAD and others who are experts in the space and who are leading the advocacy charge. So we are very proud of the 4 lists in the LGBTQ space that we've signed on to. And we hope that translates to our employees and is meaningful to them. And we also just believe that it's the right thing to do. As far as internally, there's a couple of things, benefits. We talked a little bit about coming into this. I looked into it more. So we at NBCUniversal offer LGBTQ inclusive benefits. So that includes covering domestic partners and also transgender inclusive benefits. But I was remembering, I went down the road on a journey that we went through with the HRC. We've gotten a 100 on the Corporate Equality Index for something like 9 of the last 10 years. And also, just for full transparency, NBCUniversal is owned by Comcast. We do all of this work in partnership with Comcast. So the 1 year that we weren't on the HRC list, Corporate Equality Index, or that we didn't get the 100, is actually an interesting learning point, because our HR benefits team had sunsetted the domestic partnership benefits in the wake of same-sex marriage becoming the law of the land. And at least as far as they were informed at the time, they thought that this was a fair thing to do, because we had only put up the domestic partnership benefits because of the lack of same-sex marriage equality. So we went down this journey and explained that to the HRC, and they educated us and pointed out, rightfully so, that even though same-sex marriage is not legal, there are real complications that LGBTQ people feel every day in their lives that may preclude them from wanting to get married. And those include not having equal protections, and the stigma that's attached, not having housing, that being able to be kicked out of their housing because they've come out, right? So we've since reinstated it. I think that we weren't I think a lot of companies were educated in that journey. And it does go to show you how this is another area that's fluid in this space, right? We're learning and trying to do the best that we can. Another thing that we're doing internally that I personally worked on is rolling out the ability to allow our LGBTQ employees to identify across their related identities. That includes gender identity, chosen name, expressing pronouns, and just generally being a member of the community. Of course, this is always optional, but from a practical standpoint, you'd be shocked how difficult it was. I mean, maybe you won't be, because I sense the skepticism in the room, right? It took so much longer than I expected just to work through the processes of getting this in place and launching it and communicating it, and then fixing the problems that came up, for no reason. And then continuing to manage through the downstream issues that come up that you couldn't even predict. Things like when we connect to Slack, its legal name is automatically pushed, and we have to make sure that employees can figure out how to change their profile so that they can use their chosen name. And we discovered shortly thereafter that the internal phone system was still using legal name, right? You need to make sure it's accessible so that people know how to fix this, and that all these inclusive efforts you think you're doing don't backfire on you, because all it takes is one bad experience, and that employee is going to remember that for the rest of their experience there. So we tried to think through all those things.
Thank you so much for sharing about that. I think it's interesting to hear you talk about kind of like the questions and the the ways that you have employees identify themselves, it made me think back to one of our sessions on Monday, which was about real estate, but also the complications of how do you have people respond about their identity on like a census survey in a way that will actually get the accurate information in a way that folks can then actually use the data, comb through it, and use it in a way that's productive moving forward. So resonate with that in a way that I did not expect to coming out of a real estate session. But Jen, a lot of the things that you were talking about at the very end were really centering on a person's identity. And so the theme that we had for Awareness Week this year was identity, building our futures. And I think the reason why we chose it, all of you touched on it a little bit in some of your answers, like in reference, Justin, I think you mentioned about like a lot of the bills that have been passed lately. All of you talked about like the Don't Say Gay bill that has been very recently talked about, especially with regard to Disney. So I wanted to focus a little bit more on like that sense of identity. You each talked about how you saw your identities as being fluid or less fluid. And then I also wanted to push more into the question of like intersectionality, which I know has been kind of an EDI buzzword more recently over the past few years, but to bring that a little bit more into this conversation of like, for you identifying as LGBTQ plus and also being a part of another historically minoritized group, whether that is by your race or your gender, how has being a part of the LGBTQ plus community, like, how has that played out in your life in terms of having those multiple identities, in terms of the spaces that you've been moving through? Anyone want to take that one first?
Justin, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think it's such an important question, and I think it's kind of hopefully where this idea of intersectionality is kind of where people are in their journey on diversity and inclusion, because I think early on, it's often like, oh, we need, there's the women's ERG, and there's the LGBT group, and there are the Blacks, or African Americans and things like that. But we know that oftentimes people can carry multiple marginalized identities, and so people who live at those intersections, it can oftentimes be trying to think about who am I supposed to maybe have more affinity with, or once you're in the women's group, maybe trying to find the women of color or Black women or women immigrants who may share some of those nuanced elements of your experience, when you kind of have those layered identities. And just thinking about my own experience, I think oftentimes as a Black queer man, you get posed this question of like, are you Black first or are you queer first? And I think oftentimes the implied message in that is like, do you have more loyalty to like being Black or queer? And I think the expectation, I think, is oftentimes it's like a litmus test around your racial identity, and that you're supposed to say, oh, like, I'm proudly like Black first and not necessarily queer. But I think I've appreciated, I don't know who kind of first said this, but like, it's such an impossible question because I will always be both Black and queer in any space. And what that means is sometimes in the Black community, I may face, anti-gay bias, and sometimes in queer spaces, I may face anti-Black bias. And so, I don't know, I think intersectionality, I think it's just so critical for us to evolve and really recognize that people hold these multiple identities. But I think also as queer people, it's important for us to kind of look within our community and think about what are ways that we have maybe replicated some of those systems of oppression that exist in society more broadly. And what do I mean? The focus and prioritization of maybe queer people, of cisgender people in the queer community. People, I think a lot of people were concerned that after marriage equality passed, like, are we going to see, cisgender white gay men still showing up to, really be out and concerned about, the concerns of, the trans community and trans and non-binary community, of people who are bisexual and some of these other groups that are, aren't as marginalized. And I think, who are more marginalized. And, I just have to hold myself accountable to that, I think, as well. And I think that's why I've tried to be more outspoken on trans issues, because I do think it's so easy for me as a cis queer person to just, enjoy the privileges and rights that I have now and not be as concerned about other parts of our community. So yeah, I hope that we in the queer community kind of think about, maybe even though we hold a marginalized identity or maybe multiple, we probably hold some privileged identities as well. And what type of queer community do we want to have? And how can we hopefully have a more equitable and inclusive community than the world at large?
So intersectionality is one of those new words as well, right? It's not super new, but it's new in the way that we talk about people, and maybe even a buzzword when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I bet we could spend an hour talking about intersectionality because it's so complex, right? I'm not just Mexican American. I'm not just gay. I'm not just a cis able-bodied man. There's so many other things that you don't know about me that create complexity and makes me who I am, and very unique. And same for every one of you in this room and on this call. That being said, growing up, I was naively led to believe that because I was brown and because I was gay, and perhaps even coming from an underserved, less privileged community in rural America, the odds were against me. So it was enough to be one of those, but to be all three of them was extremely overwhelming. And I had a choice to make, right? I could have played the victim, probably not the best way to describe that. I could have succumbed to all of the minority and all of the challenges that come with those underserved community, underrepresented, and maybe lived up to the expectation that I wasn't going to get any further than maybe 20 miles from the home that I grew up in. That being said, I leaned into my queerness. I leaned into my brownness. I leaned into the kid that raised livestock at the county fair and showed them to be my superpower. And I just got the chills. I could not be more proud, or I could not be prouder of at least those three things that I thought were going to keep me from getting to where I am today. And I continue to lean into them because I know they are what, in some cases, get me to hyper perform, which isn't healthy all the time, and has propelled me to where I am today. And I share that with everyone because I think we all have those great clouds over our heads, or the small voices in our heads telling us, you're not good enough. They don't look like you. They don't sound like me. They don't move like me. But you are who you are, and you have those gifts, and we need those to be better together.
That was such like a positive kind of note to end on. And thank you so much for sharing all of that and all of your parts of your identity. I know we have about like 12 minutes left, so I want to ask the closing question and maybe leave like 5 minutes for any audience questions if anything came up. So kind of and that's on a very similar note to where you ended, Raudy, wanting to focus more on like some of the joys that we can take from being part of the queer community. I think we've spent a lot of time talking about, what are the challenges we've been facing? How can we be doing better in terms of the business sense? But when we think about of all of the progress that we have made as a community to be recognized, to have these equal rights, what gives you the most hope when you think toward the future of the LGBTQ plus community, whether that's in terms of the community that you have at home in a little more personal sense, or a community in the professional context?
So my response is going to be super simple and quite elementary. What gives me the most hope is that we are sitting in a room here together, or in a Zoom box, talking about things that we haven't talked about before in the way that we're talking about them so openly, in an empowering way, and those conversations are happening with my nieces and nephews who are in high school and elementary. I think back to my niece. She wasn't quite sure how to address the topic, but she says, "Yo, Raudy, Uncle Raudy, she's like you." Izzy, I have no idea what you're talking. I knew what she was talking about, but I knew she was uncomfortable in using the word. And so I was like, "What are you talking about, Izzy? What do you mean she's like me? Like, I don't look like her." And she's like, "Yeah." And I was like, she intimated that being gay or being part of the LGBTQ plus community was part of being a club, being part of a club. And I was like, oh, now I understand what you're saying. But they're now more comfortable talking about these things in a way that doesn't seem not normal. And so it gives me hope that not only are we talking about it with our youth, in business school settings, in the corporate settings, that we're normalizing the culture, we're normalizing that we're all different and that we're all very complex, and that we have a lot to offer.
Thank you. Jen, do you want to follow up with that? I know you might have similar stories with your own daughters at home.
Yeah, I was going to take a simple approach also. I would say I probably naively hope that all the biases that people of all identities face just age out of our system and of our culture, and hope, and the younger generation gives me hope that that can be solved with time. But only time will tell, and we're our society is so divisive now that makes me second guess the potential there. But I think that being visible, representation does matter, and all of us living in this world, and being out helps the people around us. I can't tell you how many times, I've gotten that either direct feedback or indirect feedback where people are still biased, but they like me and my wife. They, oh, look at that lovely family. And they kind of start to compartmentalize these things. And I think that helps to bring them along. I think that's also a long journey, but just being out there and being visible has got to chip away at all of this.
And I'm going to take my intro maybe a little unconventional for the setting, but I'm somebody who comes from like the sexual health and public health world. I think, so much of the anxiety or discomfort around like gender identity and sexuality is like, because we broadly in society don't like talking about sex and things like that. And so I hope that maybe the LGBT community can kind of bring along a modern sexual revolution where, we destigmatize some of these topics. And like, I remember starting last summer and, one of the leaders on the global diversity inclusion team at Microsoft was just like out by poly woman. And like, I think those are things that just, even as somebody who would like to thought myself as progressive, I'm like, oh, wow, like somebody's out in poly. And like, that's just so cool, particularly as a Black woman, particularly somebody of her stature. And so, I'm going to do my part to hopefully, that we can usher in a little modern sexual revolution and just, have more open and honest dialogue about sex and sexual health. And I think, the LGBT movement has done it historically, and maybe that'll be something that we can do again in the future.
I love that so much. Thank you so much for sharing that, Justin. So does anyone, whether online or in the audience, like have any questions that came up during the panel discussion? Yeah.
I guess my question is, I work in a setting where I am able to and have the agency to advocate for my needs without fear of blowback or retribution. And so I'm interested, and I work at UCLA, so I work in higher education. I'm interested in how you all navigated difficult conversations or situations at work where your identity or LGBT plus issues came up, in a work setting or a workspace, and how did you go about managing those conversations?
Jen and Justin, were you able to hear the question?
I was going to say, can you sum up the question?
It was effectively, so when you're in the workplace, when questions have come up about your LGBTQ plus identity, how have you navigated those spaces if there's ever that fear of having that kind of like blowback, that retribution from whoever was having that conversation with you?
I'll start. I think, again, somebody coming from like nonprofit advocacy and social work, I was always concerned to like what extent could I show up and be an advocate and an activist, in business school and, corporate America. And so a way to say lean into those conversations. I think I've been surprised at how much space there is to have these conversations and dialogues. And so I hope that you would feel empowered. I would also just acknowledge, I think maybe being a cis man, I have some privileges and whatnot. Depending on the identities you hold, there is always going to be that potential for blowback. And so just trying to kind of, read the room. I think that's something I've struggled with, honestly, working remotely, is these are like very high context, conversations and discussions to have. And it's hard for me to better pick up on some of those cues virtually. So I don't know how much I can kind of push and kind of challenge things. And that's been a difficult element, but I would definitely, just encourage people to have those dialogues and conversations and do it in a smart way. I think, you're pretty aware of, or I think individuals are most aware of when they're kind of in a situation of danger. And so obviously I wouldn't, encourage you to go to a point of, getting fired or like, really undermining a team or anything of that nature. But definitely feel encouraged to get right up to that line.
I'm happy to jump in. I'll take myself off the table because I have the privilege of working in diversity in New York City. So for me, my LGBTQ identity gives me some credibility and hasn't put me on the hot seat at all. But for people who do find themselves in an awkward situation, hopefully they're working in a company with some infrastructure where they can raise any concerns and bring light to the issue. And I also, in all situations of conflict, and this is something that I'm working on personally and practicing, but just asking questions and clarifications to make people clarify their position and what they're really getting after can help somebody stand up for themselves in those uncomfortable situations.
Yeah, I think what I'd add is maybe similar to Jen, if I understood correctly. I've never been in a situation where I felt disrespected or I was told if anything, maybe more of a microaggression, which is just as bad, right? Someone can be really outward with it or a bit more subdued. What I've found, and I meant to say this earlier, given our complexity and who we are as people and human beings, is that sometimes I've been told or led to believe, people have implied that I'm not gay enough or that I'm not brown enough. And it's somewhat exhausting to try to fit their mold of what that should look like and sound like and act like. And there was one instance that I remember clearly. Unfortunately, I did nothing about because I wasn't ready and it kind of blindsided me. And we were looking to diversify an interview panel. And I specifically said, I'd love to have some Hispanic Latino representation. Says the Hispanic Latino, right? Mm-hmm. And the person replied with, oh yeah, well, I don't know what they said, but they implied that I wasn't part of the community. And I was caught off guard. I could have simply said, well, I should be that person in this instance, but I was led to believe, oh, she doesn't recognize me as a member of the community, or she doesn't believe that I am, or I'm just not enough. And in those instances of microaggression, as Jen mentioned, or outward discrimination, harassment, bullying, most organizations doing the right thing have practices in place. One, because it's the right thing to do. And secondly, federal regulation or state legislation demands that those things happen. And it's a matter of people speaking up for themselves, or if you're alongside and you see those things happening, that you're the bystander who speaks up for them on behalf of them to ensure those things don't continue to happen, and doing so in such a way that seeks to understand. Courtney, what do you mean by what you just said? And it's things like that that I think can begin to create change mindset and the way in which we think and behave in the world that we live in today.
Do we have any other questions in the last minute? All right, then I guess that's it. Justin and Jen, thank you both so much for joining on the East Coast where you are based. Raudy, thank you for flying in. And thank you everyone for attending. We still do have a couple Awareness Week events going on tomorrow at lunch, as well as a couple social events tonight, tomorrow, and Friday. So please do check them out. And thank you all for being here.